doesn't exist, then what does that do to human value and dignity then? If we're not
Yeah,
a soul at all?
yeah, great question. So this very well segues into my second argument I like to use, known as the indivisibility of personhood. So let's break that down. I am a person. I'm a human being, and human beings are persons, which we could say I possess the property of personhood. Now, the question is whether or not personhood is what philosophers call a degreed property. So the argument would go like this. I'm either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. If I'm a purely physical object, then I'm going to be divided in percentages or degrees, because purely physical objects can exist in percentages or degrees. So let's talk about the notion of what's called a degreed property. So properties like being loud or hard are degreed properties, which means they can fluctuate. They can come in degrees or percentages. Something that is hard can be softer or harder. Something that is loud can be louder or quieter. These are properties that can change and fluctuate. They can exist in percentages or degrees. By contrast, non-degreed properties are the opposite. They don't exist in percentages or degrees. They are all or nothing kind of things. So to illustrate, the property of being even, let's say. So the number 2 and the number 6 are both even numbers, but it would make no sense to say that the number 6 is, quote, more even than the number 2. Why? Because the property of being even is non-degreed. It is a all or nothing kind of thing. There's no in between. It either is or it isn't. So, with this in mind, if we would agree and recognize that human beings have intrinsic value in virtue of the fact that they are persons, well, we can ask the question, what is it that grounds personhood? Now remember, if there's no soul and everything is just physical, then the property of being a person is going to be grounded in something physical like our body. But here's where this runs into problems. Men are typically larger than women. In other words, men typically have more mass and matter than women. But are we going to seriously say that someone with more mass and matter would mean that they matter more? Well, no, of course not. Why? Well, because we know that everyone's equally valued regardless of your size. However, if physicalism is true, then you're going to have to ground personhood in something physical. And the problem, again, is that not everybody shares the same amount of mass and matter. So the more or less mass and matter you have, well, the more or less you're going to have to ground the property of being a person. Now, the implications would be you get into things like, well, abortion or just even euthanasia or genocide, you name it. If someone is not as big as me, then I now become more valuable than they are. But clearly, we should all recognize that as an absurd way of thinking. Well, but if that's an absurd way of thinking, that would have to imply then our property of being a person must be grounded in something that is beyond the physical, namely something like the soul.